All right, go for it.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good whatever the heck in the world or wherever in the world you are. It's the one, the oldie, V, the Grill Economist, and I am here with a man that needs no introduction. And you know it's Monday, and if it's Monday and it's about 10 a.m. on the Eastern Seaboard, you know it is time for the Sirius Report. And we're talking about the Sirius Report. We're talking about the main man, the one, the only London Paul. And folks, if you have not done so already, if you haven't gotten a clue yet, you need to. Go to theseriesreport.com, subscribe to his premier service that he has every day. You get a daily intelligence brief from Paul. Excuse me, John, I'm running low on dark roast. From Paul that gives you the entire landscape of the geostrategic world. Okay, it's very valuable. It's your own personal intelligence brief. It is cheaper than the price of a venti latte from Starbucks. So go treat yourself with real information. And folks, I've said this so many times. There are very few wells in this quote unquote worldwide web you can get this type of information from. London Paul and the Sirius Report is one of them. So make haste, go there for less than the price of a Starbucks latte for $4.75 per month. The Sirius Report's premier service. With that being said, London Paul, sir, how are you?
Yes, I'm very well and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone listening. And how are you, V?
I'm hanging in there, man. You know, it's a Monday. Recovering from the weekend in the sense that pretty busy weekend. It was a good weekend, and unfortunately, the weekend wasn't long enough for me to really enjoy it all the more. So I'm back. It's Monday.
Yeah,
Could
it's
be better,
actually a
could be
public.
worse.
Yeah, it's a public holiday in the UK today.
Oh, is it?
So, yeah, and the weather's quite reasonable, which is a bit of a miracle. But yeah, it's the last one of the year until Christmas.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. Oh, that's
Yeah,
great.
yeah, we're a bit thin on the ground for public holidays.
You guys don't have Thanksgiving or anything like that over there, do you?
No, no, we don't. No, no.
You guys have your own Black
We
Friday,
sh well, we've inherited the US's Black Friday, I think, so we just have it on the same day.
You've also inherited our GMO fast food.
Yeah, not too bad. We're not really. There's places you can buy food that's not GMO. In fact, yeah, there is some of it, but not an awful lot of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's probably creeping in the back door in
Oh,
some ways, like all these things do. But
exactly. So, Paul, what's going on, man? Where do you want to start? There's a lot of things happening throughout the world. The U.S. is threatening China with trade tariffs and all these other things.
yeah,
I made fun of
yeah,
it this morning. So, if you want to delve into
yeah.
that, whatever you want to do.
Let's start with the US, even though that might upset some people who don't
Oh,
like.
you mean the ones that says, Paul, you don't have a right to comment on U.S. because you're an Englishman. That kind of people. The same kind of people said, "Gee, you ain't got the right to talk about pancreatic cancer because you don't have pancreatic cancer."
Well, yeah, it's kind of anyway. I think obviously there was the whole kind of business with Bannon leaving the White House, and we kind of said, I mean, in very broad terms, I'm not giving too much away, which we said to people on the podcast, but there are big reasons for this. But one thing that's come out in the public media that I think there's no point putting it in a podcast was Rohrabacher, or how do you pronounce it? Rohrabacher, I think it is, met with
Rohrabacher, right?
Assange. Yeah, I think that's hugely relevant because there's no way he went along just to exchange pleasantries. And I know some of the comments came out referred to the fact that he was giving some information regarding the whole DNC mail server thing. From my perspective, he met Assange to discuss far more than that. It's far more encompassing than just that remit. And by all accounts, he's supposed to go back and report this to Trump and presumably to the inner circle and the administration. Now, the fallout of that won't be felt for a while, but I suspect Assange told him one heck of a lot of things that would be quite advantageous to, we've better be careful using the phrase, taking down the cesspit or the swamp, but there are reasons, and this is the whole sort of fallout from Bannon. This is one of the reasons the timing was not, it isn't a coincidence, put it that way. And I think we have to wait for the fallout of that, but I expect that meeting with Assange will produce some very interesting results. And yes, Bannon leaving is a bit of a surprise to people, but it's clearly obvious that him leaving is to try, and he said himself, I'm going to go to war. So I think Raw are back at going to meet Assange that isn't going to war, but it's part of the process of gleaning information and acquiring the information to say, right, now we can really have a proper assault on those people who've effectively been largely responsible for destroying the US, and not just the US, but other nations around the world. And it's not just people in the US who are responsible. You know, I call it the cabal, you can call it the deep state, it doesn't really matter. But I think there'll be a big fallout from this. When, no one can say. It could take weeks, months, who knows, but it's an important meeting, and it's a part of a bigger process that's going on.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that, man. I think it definitely is. I think I'm starting to sense here that Julian Assange very soon could be a very free man, and if Donald Trump were to do that, and just like what he did with Sheriff Joe Arpaio, if he's able to get Assange free, there are many people that are in the libertarian and even in liberal circles, excuse me, that see Assange as a hero. So this is huge. This will be major bonus point, and it would make Trump seem more libertarian and centrist than what a lot of people are viewing him to be, Paul.
Yeah, and that's part of, I think, is part of the thing that in return for providing a whole bunch of information and relating to, umpteen different matters, that Assange, can be freed as a result of that. I mean, we'll see what transpires, but it got a little bit of press coverage, but it's completely understated as to the significance of that meeting. And the fact it was made public as well, I think, is very kind of indicative that, yes, there's a private side to the things that are going on, but there's also a public face that's saying, yeah, he met Assange. And if you don't like it, tough, because there's reasons behind this. And the people who Assange will have referred to will be slightly nervous. And there's no doubt about it, Congress and the Senate are getting very nervous now about these kind of things, because despite all the hot air and rhetoric, there are people there, it doesn't matter who they are by name, but they're certainly feeling the heat now, and the heat's getting turned up on them.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even people like, it's funny for me to see, Jeff, the Reefer Madness Sessions, even saying that WikiLeaks should be like categorized as some sort of a terrorist organization, which I find to be absolutely laughable, Paul. I think there's a lot of nervousness everywhere, especially in the Hillary Clinton camp. I hear there's a lot of chattering of teeth, Paul.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. I mean, amongst many, I mean, and we don't know exactly what WikiLeaks knows or doesn't know, and how much information they've released or haven't released, but you can guarantee that they've only released a very small proportion of things they know, because it'll be a strategic approach of releasing information. Now, the question is, a lot of people in the world will take a blind eye and say, well, I'm not really interested in what WikiLeaks say, because they've swallowed the kind of mainstream media narrative about them. But eventually it depends what information comes out, how it comes out, who backs it, and who supports these allegations that will be made. And we have to say allegations, not because they might not be factual, but if you're going to make things stick and actually adjudicate people, things have to be done in a manner that means you can make things stick in a court of law and not just get thrown out on a technicality. And we've said this before, but it's very important, because people get very stressed about the fact they feel nothing's being done and they want to see mass arrests. But it's not a simple question of just turning up and arresting someone, because you can guarantee if you did, within 24 hours or less, they'll be released, and within a week or two, the whole thing will be dropped and squashed, and that'll be the end of it. And you've lost your opportunity.
Correct.
You're not going to be able to go back in the future and revisit those opportunities. So if someone needs to be adjudicated, it has to be done where you dot every I and cross every T. And yes, that can be frustrating and very time consuming, but at the end of the day, if people are guilty of things, you want to make it stick. And I think you've made the point, and it's true, if one high profile person, the US, the UK, wherever it might be, ends up being adjudicated, it's going to send shockwaves. It's going to wake a lot of people up who don't understand anything. And that's part of the problem. The vast majority of people are still largely in the dark and have no understanding of how the world operates. And yet it is frustrating, but that's the reality. And we have to bear that in mind, and that goes for any country. It doesn't matter whether it's the UK or the US. I mean, I know the UK, yes, more and more people are waking up to what's going on, but there's an awful lot of people who don't have a clue. And it's not because of ignorance. It's because they just simply have never had the time to be able to spend to understand this, because their lives are so consumed just trying to feed their families and keep a roof over their head. And that's by design, because they don't want people to think. Because as soon as people think and have time to reflect on the reality, they're not going to tolerate it. And at some point, yes, the floodgates will open, but we're not at that point at the moment. So we just have to be patient in that regard as well.
Right, absolutely correct.
I mean,
Paul,
I think also,
yeah, go ahead.
What's worth mentioning is what I've learned is, and it's been talked about in the past, that the US military morale is in real sharp decline, and they're really fed up. They're fed up with the fact, and you made the point, we don't need to labor about all the hardware and how useless it is, but they're fed up of being sucked to go into wars. Like, I mean, Afghanistan's a great example, that they're being sucked in to go and send more troops in there. And, if we understand the reality of what's going on in the Middle East, there's a lot of these troops who are going to understand likewise, and they're going in saying, we're fighting this pointless war. Because I'm bearing in mind that our intelligence agencies and other intelligence agencies have been backing the very people we're fighting against. That is going to cause severe morale problems. And the truth is, Afghanistan has become a farce because the US wants to send military in again. They don't really want to have a war. They've already said to the Russians, we're quite happy to go along with your peace plan. We just want to keep the narcotics trade going, and we want to have our slice of the cake with the mineral wealth, which it runs into trillions of dollars. But the point is, everyone says about what happens to all the US taxpayers' money, and it all gets siphoned here and everywhere. Now, the reality is, and this may surprise people, but the narcotics trade makes the cabal $1 trillion a year. That's how they finance all their black ops, all their budgets. That's what they use the money for. That's why you'll never see an end to the drugs trade, why they will never if they don't want to legalize it, and also why we will never have a cashless society. Because if we had a cashless society, that $1 trillion trade blows up overnight, it's gone. Right. So all the talk of cashless trade is never going to happen. We talked about this for quite a few years, and people will argue to the contrary. It makes great headlines, all this cashless society in it, and also it's kind of got sucked into the whole crypto space about it being cashless society. And it's some kind of devious attempt by the cabal to suck people into a cashless society. No, it's not. And the whole simple fact is they will never have it, because what are they going to do? Sacrifice $1 trillion just for the principle of having a cashless society. And they don't need a cashless society, because most people don't use cash anyway. Most of us now use bank cards, credit cards, and have electronic transactions. So they don't care about that. They have if they want to go and find out about you and me, they just phone up a bank and say, right, we need the information on this person. And they can request that information and be given it. I mean, the customs and excise people in the UK have more power than anyone. So if they really want to, and it's probably the same, I don't know for definite, but it's probably very similar or the same in the US. The IRS has immense power to be able to seize any information they want. And in the context of cryptos and a bit later, but not at this point. So I think that's a huge consideration. So it's the farcical nature. The US just wants to be in Afghanistan because it's the cash cow the cabal needs to keep their empire ticking over. When that's cut off, it's absolutely is game over, because they have no more resources. Now, to some extent, that narcotics trade's being cut off. A lot of it's being seized, and it's not getting to the end target. So it probably isn't $1 trillion anymore, but it has been for a long period of time. That's a huge consideration. But the morale for the US military is appalling, because they know full well why they're really there. They're not there to fight this pseudo-terrorist that they've been told this war on terror since 2001 is nonsense and a lie. They're there to fight a war to make sure that narcotics flood into the US, the UK, and everywhere else as a result of it. And look at the damage it's done to people as a result. I mean, people with opiate addictions gone through the roof, and it's the same in the UK, it's the same in the US, same everywhere else. So it's destroying people's lives in the process. It must be a very hard, bitter pill to swallow to be sent there to fight a fake war when you know what the reality is. But that is certainly becoming more and more of a focal point for people in the military.
Yeah, it really is, and I think that's a point that's very well said. I mean, these guys. That's why they vilify cryptocurrencies, and they make you think that drug cartels and terrorist organizations are using cryptocurrencies as their transaction de jour over what terrorists and drug cartels actually prefer, which is cash. Which is cash.
Yes,
And
exactly.
and that's why
I mean, it might be worth. Yeah, sorry, go on.
yeah, they might be using a little bit of crypto here and there, but their whole enchilada is in cash. That's where they do their thing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's how the whole industry operates. But in terms of cryptos, there was a couple of points worth making, and it remains to be seen how enforceable and how easy they are to enforce it. But the IRS has basically come out now and said, look, we can track Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. They've purchased software from this blockchain analysis group called Chain Analysis.
Yeah, chain analysis.
Now they're saying they're cracking down on this because digital currency. They said only a few hundred people declared profits or losses in 2015, and they're saying they can track addresses through blockchain and centralized exchange. Coming out with these statements that it visualizes, tracks, and analyzes transactions on the blockchain, and they're saying agencies from law enforcement, IRS, and banks will be able to use the tool. Now, the question is, yeah, okay, so that I don't doubt it. I mean, I've said this before. It's as much as everything's decentralized with cryptocurrencies, the problem is it doesn't detract from the fact that from a legal standpoint, I mean, it's the same. If I've registered. I haven't bought cryptocurrencies, and I've been honest about that, and I still haven't. But I've registered with exchanges, and my goodness, the amount for anti-money laundering regulations they required me to provide passport, proof of address, etc., etc. So they have all this information. Now, if HMRC in the UK or the IRS request that information, they're not going to be very hard pressed to resist the request for that information. So that was one point. The second point that bothered me was, obviously the Chicago Board Options Exchange said it's going to list Bitcoin futures and create a futures market with cash settled Bitcoin futures, potentially as early as the fourth quarter of this year or early 2015. And what they're saying is, oh, it's a lot easier than going out and signing up for a Bitcoin account and exchanges. You can just buy an ETF with an E-Trade account. And look at what gold ETF did with gold.
Right.
Well, we all know what gold ETF did with gold.
That ETF and how it's going to manipulate the price of Bitcoin, it's going to have zero effect because, again, those who are actually utilizing Bitcoin and using it, they don't care what Wall Street's doing. It's like complete anathema to them. So what these guys are doing, trying to get in on the Bitcoin trade, thinking that they're going to do a futures contract and smash down the price of Bitcoin in the future, has no bearing because it's unlike gold. We know exactly how much Bitcoin will be mined. It's only going to be 21 million, and that's it. And then having it all recorded on the blockchain. So, best of luck with that for the banksters.
Yeah, it is, but it is a bit of a concern as to because it's pretty obvious. They're not doing it to aid, and I mean, they're claiming, oh, well, it'll make Bitcoin far more easily accessible to the average person. Well, we know that's absolutely not true.
Yeah, exactly.
So they've obviously got nefarious intent.
Person, Paul. They care
yes,
so
exactly. But they've obviously got nefarious intent. And we'll see what develops. But I mention it just as a point of observation to say, look, this is happening. If things come out, and I think they're worth mentioning, we'll mention it because people need to be aware of it. I mean, I think burying our head in the sand and pretending these things aren't happening is not healthy to anyone. But I mean, we'll see to what extent they think they can influence the market, and that does remain to be seen. But the fact they're considering setting up is clearly what they're trying to do is get people not investing directly in Bitcoin and going, well, this is far easier because, you don't need to go through all this validation through exchanges. And you don't have all this problem of buying coins as well. Just come and trade. It's almost like, a kind of almost it's almost like derivative trading. You can just go in. I mean, I've got I'm not mentioning the company because I don't like advertising companies, but where I can go long and short on anything.
Yeah.
One of those type of companies. Now they're probably going to set this up and go, well, you can short at Bitcoin and you can go long on Bitcoin, but obviously the question, as with all these things, is what's the underlying trade backed by? Well, that in itself is a huge question that I'd like someone at the CBOE to answer, because I can't see what it's backed by. I don't believe for 1 minute it's going to be backed by Bitcoin. I mean, it's just, what are they going to do? Buy up a block of Bitcoin and then start? I mean, so it's obviously not true in that sense. So it's a major problem that they think that, and it is a process. It's like the IRS; they're trying to influence cryptocurrencies and trying to, in some way, sour the markets and also get people to be worried about the prospects of investing in it. I mean, cryptocurrencies in general.
Correct. No, exactly right, man. They're gonna try to do what they can with cryptos. The funny thing with a lot of these banks, man, they understand the blockchain. They're trying to get a hold of it, but they just can't seem to break it. They can't seem to manipulate it. They can do what they can by affecting the exchanges, and again, they can't stop the blockchain revolution. So what they're trying to do right now, Paul, is they're trying to, what I call, and I gave a term called ghettoization. They're trying to get us into these crypto ghettos. And these crypto ghettos, we see them today, places like Coinbase. Okay. And the company that owns Coinbase is very much involved. I think there's like one company that owns like 2 or 3 exchanges. And these guys are in bed. And I forgot the exact, I think it's called Digital Currency Group. I think DCG, I think is the company that owns it. And these guys are in bed with the SEC and the regulators. And their plan is to basically, again, for the United States, and it's affecting United States customers only, their plan is to ghettoize us into 2 or 3 places of these exchanges where we can go ahead and buy Bitcoin, quote unquote, or buy an ETF, or buy Ethereum, or buy, whatever other, cryptocurrency that's out there, and use that as a model. But, for anybody who's dealt with a company like Coinbase will know that if you're buying a Bitcoin, it's taking forever for your Bitcoin to show up. It's taking forever for you to, get your Bitcoin out of the Coinbase wallet and into your own personal wallet. So these are certain things that are kind of worrisome.
Mm-hmm.
Then on top of that, using this ghettoized cartel type model to use that, and even in Western Europe and other places, that's what they're trying to do. They can't stop it. What they're trying to do is the ebb and flow, kind of like what they do with the World Wide Web. They took the World Wide Web, which is so, it's a beautiful, free flowing river of information. And what they do, they ghettoized us into the ghettos of Facebook, into the ghettos of Google, YouTube, Twitter. And that's where people spend the majority of their time, Instagram, all these other things. So that they're trying to do the same thing with cryptocurrencies. It's not going to work this time.
Well, it's not. It won't ultimately work with the internet. All these companies will just disappear. I mean, in the fullness of time, and people make choices, and the internet will evolve, and cryptocurrencies will evolve. So yeah, it's a law of diminishing returns for them. But of course, they will try to do it and be as disruptive as they can. But it's rather like what's happening in the world, though. In a different sense, the cabal's trying to be as disruptive as they can, but the returns are becoming more and more diminished, and in the process, and it's a bit of a tangential step. It feeds into the point. This thing in the U.S. Embassy in Havana, where these 16 Americans have become ill in the last year from some mysterious health attack, is having serious repercussions in U.S. intelligence circles, because the question they're asking is, what the hell was the attack? And why are all our employees starting to feel ill a matter of months later? And it's another example of the fear factor, because it's the same with the US Navy. Okay, they're trying to gloss it over that it was human error how these oil cargo tankers are crashing into their Navy ships, but it isn't. There is some fundamental problem. You don't recall all your vessels to assess the problem and realize, and there are some big fundamental problems when you've got ridiculous operating systems that are so out of date. And as you say, they literally have to be rebooted when there's a problem. And if the reboot fails, then what's the manual failover? Well, half of the people operating this don't know what the manual failover is, because they think it's just like rebooting a laptop or something. I mean, it's that. So there is human error and problems, but in the process, this is starting to generate a lot of fear, and that US embassy in Havana is one example where there is a lot of fear inside US intelligence circles now as to how the hell did this happen? Because if they can do it in Havana, it doesn't stop this happening anywhere. And of course that is absolutely the case. So therefore there's huge problems. And North Korea is another example. We talked about this and said it was all hot air rhetoric, and then we hear that the North Koreans have fired missiles with varying degrees of success. There were 3 of them. Most of the world has been no response, and Tillerson's basically said, well, we just have to continue with dialogue. Is it because the US doesn't have the military capability anymore to go into North Korea? And if they take a preemptive strike, and I've said this before and I've said it several times, they've been told, if you want your entire navy to be sunk to the bottom of the sea in that region, be our guest, because if you do that, we're not going to tolerate it anymore. Russia and China are serious about this. That's why we've had this whole muted response. Yes, there's a problem with North Korea, but the Americans know full well what are they going to do? Launch a preemptive missile attack, and what's that going to achieve? All it's going to end up is turning South Korea into a they don't have nuclear weapons, North Korea, but the damage they could cause. Then what are they going to do? Send ground forces into North Korea? Well, good luck with that, because the North Koreans will wipe the floor with the Americans and the South Koreans, or anyone else for that matter, who decides to walk in. They've got a huge, well-trained, drilled army who will massacre anyone who decides to walk into their country. So that's not an option either. Yes, there are problems and there needs to be some negotiation, but bombing your way around the world, those days have gone. It just is not possible anymore to do it. And if the US decides to take preemptive action, it will be one of the most ridiculously stupid things in their history that they could ever seek to achieve. And therefore, we hope common sense prevails. And I think Tillerson's actions demonstrate there is caution and a desire not to become heavy-handed in that region. But then there are there are mutterings again of Tillerson leaving, and if Tillerson leaves, it will be a disaster for the Trump administration. But it will also be an enormous disaster for Trump. If Trump fires in, it will be the biggest mistake he has ever made.
Absolutely.
And it will be a fatal mistake for him in many ways, because Tillerson is the one person who is counterbalancing the idea of going to war, and Ukraine's a great example of, it's like they're moving around the world. When they couldn't achieve things in Syria, they decided to go and fight a war front in North Korea, and that failed. And now we have this preposterous issue to do with Ukraine, where there's talk of providing the Ukrainians lethal aid. Now, I mean, this is beyond farcical, but the reality is the US administration is, I don't know, I mean, we could say it's Poroshenko, we could say it's the US intelligence service, it could be anybody, it doesn't really matter. But Donald Trump believes that the Russians have thousands of their troops on Ukrainian soil. Well, no, they don't.
Thanks to H.R. McNuggets and James I read storybooks Mattis.
Well, Mattis has also said they want to put pressure on Russia because of its aggressive behavior. Well, actually, go and see the reality, Mattis. Go and visit Donbass, where the Ukraine military is bombing indiscriminately civilians, and repeatedly does this and hits civilian target. And of course, the biggest irony is this whole Nazi thing is farcical when you think that they're blowing and spitting the dummy about supposed neo-Nazis in the US, but they're quite happy to back neo-Nazis who overthrew a democratic government in Ukraine and support neo-Nazis who are fighting a war which amounts to actually war crimes in Ukraine, well, in the Donbass region. And, Mattis is publicly stating things like, well, Russia's failed to abide by the Minsk ceasefire agreement. Well, and then he's also actually said that Russia's seeking to redraw international borders by force and undermining the sovereignty and free nations of Europe. I mean, if he seriously is suggesting this, then the question is, on what grounds is he coming to this idea that this is a reality? Because everybody knows it's not reality, but the fact they keep spinning this narrative just doesn't watch. Do they realize nobody believes it anymore? It's rather like the whole Russiagate narrative over the US. That's stopped. It's in fact, you don't really hear about it anymore because the media's dropped it because it's become so embarrassing.
Right.
And this is the basis for giving lethal weapons in Ukraine. And what are they going to use these lethal weapons? They're going to use it to kill more people in Donbass. So the Ukrainians don't abide by the Minsk Accord, who are the ones who are violating it every day, and it's got nothing to do with the Russians. But yet the strange thing is, you have the flip side of US policy where we have the Normandy talks where they've come up, which is obviously Merkel, and you've got Putin, and now Macron. And the Ukrainians have come up with this ceasefire agreement. Kiev actually thinks that Moscow and Washington are now deciding the fate of Ukraine itself in terms of how things should be administered. So we have this flip side where you have that element of kind of diplomacy and foreign affairs, which is trying to resolve the problem. And then you have the US military, in inverted commas, where you've got Mattis coming back suggesting, well, I think we should give lethal weapons to the Ukrainians. I mean, it's absolutely farcical. And we put an article on the website about the kind of the whole interference of Ukraine inside the US election process. And it makes a mockery. And the problem is, it's this complete lack of consistency where you have people who are trying to form diplomatic solutions in places like Ukraine.
Yeah.
And then we have this situation, well, we've run out of steam in Syria, we've run out of steam in North Korea. Okay, let's see if we can start something up in Ukraine again.
And Afghanistan, let's not forget about that.
And Afghanistan. You know? Well, Afghanistan is less about wanting to fight a war. It's all about making sure that the lucrative money still comes through from narcos. So that's the primary purpose. Yeah, but of course the problem is if they go in there, the Taliban will just wipe the floor with them. And interestingly, what I wasn't aware of, but only just recently became aware of, is apparently there's a lot of people who went to fight, who were given effectively green cards to fight for the US military. And thousands of them have been killed. And not one of them has gone home, and they're all housed in refrigerators in Afghanistan to hide the fact they've all been murdered.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's to hide, and this is the kind of debacle now that's going on. And this is why, from the US military's point of view, I mean, people think I'm attacking. I am not attacking the US military personnel. I'm attacking the fact of the idiots who send them into wars, who provide them ill-equipped. I mean, it is true. Most of the US military hardware is useless.
It is.
It's a sad fact. It's reality. And they're putting these servicemen's lives on the line for no reason other than pure profit. There's no political motivation. The whole war on terror thing, I don't know, maybe some people in Europe believe it and in the US, but no one in the rest of the world believes it because they know the war on terror was a complete lie. It was just purely a vindication to overthrow people who didn't subscribe to their viewpoint of acquiescing to the US and who wanted to trade in non-dollar terms and issue gold-backed currencies and et cetera, or didn't want their gas pipelines put through their country as Assad was. But I think increasingly the US military becoming aware of this more and more, and they're realizing the reality, and that is very, very frustrating, but also very demoralizing for them. And I mean, there's no chance of the US sending in troops into Ukraine, although there has been, obviously, there's no doubt there's been intelligence service operatives in some capacity or other. But once again, they're going to provide all this lethal hardware for no purpose other than just to keep a war going, because they think in some way it might weaken the Russians and allow them to continue economically to punish Russia through sanctions. Because if the whole Ukraine thing collapsed,
joke,
and the Ukrainians were held responsible, Russian sanctions would disappear overnight. And what would it also do? It would drive a huge hammer blow through this whole Russiagate debacle, and all of a sudden Trump could then say, well, actually, we can start to normalize relations with Russia. They want to escalate tensions in the Ukraine to make sure that there's no chance that the Trump administration can normalize relations with the Russians. That's ultimately what it's all about. Because the day that happens, that is a huge hammer blow for the cabal, because for all the obvious reason, and it makes common sense to normalize those relations with Russia. But you've also got the problem is is, as much as we can see this with the Russians, there's also the Chinese, and it's happening directly and indirectly with the Chinese. We have the stupid farce of US trade sanctions, and you're absolutely right. You mentioned before, China is giving serious consideration to saying, right, we'll just have mass de-dollarization on every level, and we'll kill the dollar, because they are absolutely fed up with what's going on. Because not only is the US, whoever it is, attacking them financially, they're using other nations in the process. And interestingly, the Cambodians came out with a statement the other day where they basically accused the US of meddling in their elections. I mean, they came out with some pretty harsh rhetoric, accusing the US of being brutal and bloodthirsty and interfering in other affairs. And they have accused Washington, in inverted commas, for supporting the Cambodian opposition. And when we look at what would be the rationale behind this, well, the current Prime Minister of Cambodia is very supportive of China, wants to work in terms of the One Belt, One Road, and form strong, bilateral relations with Beijing. The opposition leader is quite the opposite. He doesn't want any dealings with China. He wants to strengthen relations with the US. Now, we can say it's just an accusation, but once again, it's trying to economically disadvantage and harm the Chinese. Another great example that came up was, and we talked about this whole kind of skirmish on the Chinese-Indian border, which we said was hot air and nonsense and wouldn't come to anything,
Right.
Despite the fact numerous mainstream tabloids and also alternative media people were suggesting it'd lead to a major war. Well,
it'll be World War III.
Well, what if India and China have reached an agreement on the disengagement of troops in Doklam? They've said that, the statements come out. Interestingly, the Chinese have said that India's removed its servicemen and military equipment, which illegally crossed their border, and they've withdrawn back behind their border. And
of course,
and China's saying we're going to make sure we'll take all measures to make sure we preserve our territorial integrity and sovereignty. Now, this dispute's been going on since mid-June. It's all simmered down. Now, is it any coincidence that it's India and China? Bearing in mind, what is the one thing that the US cabal don't want? They don't want China having strong relations with India. They want to use India as a wedge to try and form their own kind of One Belt, One Road. I'm surprised we haven't seen the US cabal really going for Pakistan in a big way, because Pakistan forms, you've got, the China-Pakistan economic corridor as part of the One Belt, One Road, which will stretch down to Gwadar, which is the deep port on the coast. Now, that is a real serious hammer blow to the cabal, having that geopolitical and geoeconomic link. So they're trying to use India to stoke tensions with China, and it's all just trying to be disruptive. So as much as they're going for Russia in an overt way with sanctions, but also actually kind of sort of now going for China in an overt way with sanctions, or imposing tariffs, etc. The reality is, economically, they're trying to damage China in other parts of the world. So indirectly in Cambodia, indirectly with India, probably they'll try and stoke some tensions with Pakistan in the process. Afghanistan's another example why the fear came in, because Afghanistan's very keen to form strong relations to be part of the One Belt, One Road with China, but it wants Russian military intervention in Afghanistan and doesn't want the US military intervention there. But ultimately, we know the military intervention is purely an economic reason. So they're also attacking China, but China do have options. I mean, they can be very civilized, diplomatic, but if you push them too far, all they have to do is go, right, well, this month we've just dumped 200 billion US treasuries. Next month we're going to dump 400 billion. We'll just dump the lot. And as much as they've been hiding all their treasuries being dumped through the exchange stabilization fund in part, and also siphoning through strange countries who have no reason to hold 300 billion US treasuries.
Correct.
Things like obviously Liechtenstein and Cayman Islands and et cetera, et cetera. Now, the reality is, if they do that, that is the end, because the US dollar will just eviscerate. Because as soon as, what are they going to do? Keep hiding, and China's just going to come out, and they've publicly said the option which will be most advantageous is just de-dollarizing, dumping dollar assets, whatever you want to call it. That is a very serious implication, but also the fact that China is saying all these things publicly means they must be reaching the point where they've just had enough. And if they do, they will dump it in serious quantities. And it will have catastrophic effects for the US economy. But that's the desperation. Because bear in mind, the cabal don't care about the US people. They don't care about the US nation. They'll destroy it if it benefits them. So as far as they're concerned, who cares what happens? But in the process, they're going to fight a war with the Chinese. They can't win for all the reasons we've said before. But principally, China's their biggest creditor.
Yeah.
So it's absolutely impossible for them to achieve that objective. But that's why we're seeing these skirmishes. But nations are starting to wake up and go, hang on, why are we actually having this skirmish? What is the point of this? And India, and people have disagreed. Someone disagreed with me in the comments section about the role with China and India and what's going on. India is very much playing both sides at the moment, not sure what to do, but it does because a lot of Indian economic ministers and inside the Indian government want to form strong ties with China and be part of the One Belt, One Road, but rather like the US administration, it's split and fragmented. And there are other people who are supporting the US cabal viewpoint of, well, actually, we don't want you to be forming these relations with China. Why not form your own One Belt, One Road in a scaled down way and try and disrupt the whole CPEC in the process? And that's more or less precisely what's going on.
Yeah. Absolutely correct. I mean, the whole thing with India and China and how people are saying it's going to spin into a much larger war. It's not. It's not going to happen. Number one. Number two. Anybody who says that doesn't understand the politics and the history of that region and the culture of that region. And I'll tell you one thing. Historically, India and China has always gotten along. There's never been, historically going back thousands of years, never been any problem up until the Kargil War that occurred. I think was the Cargill? I can't even remember what it was. The 1963 conflict they had. It's a border skirmish issue where they had a fight. China quickly came in and stomped it, put an end to it. India understands its future is along the Asian sphere, especially the Southeast Asian sphere of influence. China understands this. Okay. I think they're going to play very nicely together, especially as Vladimir Putin and the Russians being the mediators between these two powers, Paul. I think things will work out quite nice. We just need to get the Indians need to get the Congress Party, the cabal, connected Congress Party out, and that's what's causing most of these problems.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, without any shadow of a doubt, and yeah, I think long term there's optimism that this. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous because of course India is part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Exactly.
It's part of BRICS. I mean, it's part of the AIB. It's ticked all the boxes in a lot of ways, but as you say, unfortunately, it's just that it's the political divisions within the country that causes these kind of strange policies of, I mean, rather like the US, it just has these kind of crazy ideas on the one hand about Ukraine and has very sensible, balanced, mature ideas on the other hand. But I think it's kind of moving on, but it's worth discussing. I mean, I put the YouTube clip out, was Barcelona the start of terrorist attacks around Europe? And of course, absolutely, it's transpired to be the case. But they've taken on this whole new kind of ideology, where in the past it was kind of, yes, there was bombings and of course we had the vehicle attacks. Now it just seems to be that random people go out on the street armed with swords or knives and just attack people.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the new MO with them, which of course no intelligence agency on this planet can monitor that, because anybody could just do that. It's very spontaneous. It needs no planning if people just do it randomly. That is a big concern and a big problem, and it's not going to go away. And we saw an attack in Buckingham Palace a couple of days ago. Same sort of thing. This is what seems to be the new MO. It's just random attacks. And why are they doing this? Because it's just to fuel anger amongst the people and drive divisions within society, and then blame everybody because they say, oh, this person who did this attack is a Muslim. Oh, well, therefore, I just dislike all Muslims in the process. And it's just the divide and conquer mentality. But what was great to see, and this is what, we talked about the alt-left, alt-right, which is all engineered to divide the US in half and have people fighting each other. What happened in Barcelona after the attack? 500,000 people took to the streets of the city to refute the ongoing global and local violence. They all stood together. People may say that some of them were there for, like the reigning king turned up and the prime minister turned up. Yes, people say that might be a photo opportunity, but there was emergency workers, police, residents, people from all ethnic and religious backgrounds all marched together and said, condemning violence, saying we've had enough of it, we don't want it. If you want to make protests about things, that is how you protest. That is exactly what will annoy the cabal no end, because they don't want people doing that. They want people to then be divided. So Barcelona gets split into factions of people who say one thing. So, and because you say that, you're automatically branded as being, oh, you must be alt-right because you disagree with the alt-left, or vice versa for that matter. That is what they're trying to engineer. And we saw in Barcelona where the people said, no, we're just sick to death of this. We don't want any of this violence, this terrorism, whatever you want to call it, carrying on anymore. That is how the world has to unite against this. If you're going to get divided and conquered, fine, but you're going to have to take the consequences, and it will get very ugly. And it's like the alt-left, alt-right in the US. If everybody ignored them, stopped talking about them, stopped mentioning them in media publications, it would all die a death and disappear, and that would be the end of it. You would never hear of it again, because it is a small minority of people, a lot of infiltration, definitely people on both sides being paid to play a role, and it's part of that role to divide people. So don't fall for the trap. And if you want to protest about things, if everybody protests in unison together, that has far more strength of power and purpose in changing things than getting divided as a result of what's happening across Europe. And there's no doubt about it. It's trying to fuel, because there is huge problems with people with regards to immigration in Europe. I mean, France is a great example of that. And it's probably a good point just to mention in regards to Macron. Now, Macron is having major problems is very quickly into his presidency. I mean, this is the one thing you don't want to be having as your enemy in France. The trade unions are very powerful in France, so they're threatening national strikes and blockades against Macron. He's very deeply unpopular, and part of it, he's got these controversial plans to revamp labour laws, which means people can be hired and fired easily. France, it's very difficult for people to be made redundant. There's very strict laws about working hours. Now,
yeah. I mean, I was a full-time employee. You work like 10 hours a week. You have 6 months vacation.
Well, I think they do 35 hours a week in France, and that's kind of So he's being very unpopular and doing things they don't like. But in the process, he really is on a knife edge in terms of his popularity. Now, there is a risk that some of these might be rigged in terms of the polls, as they have been with Trump in recent time. But there's no doubt he's made some unpopular decisions. But the one thing is, he hasn't done what everyone thought he would do as a Rothschild showing, but he's now feeling it very hard in terms of what the unions may do. And the unions could cause mayhem. There's also massive problems to do with immigration in France, and people are fed up with what's going on. So France could become a real powder keg, and in the process, it may just tip the balance where some pretty ugly, nasty things could happen. And yes, they've tried to reform the labour laws in France for 20 years and failed. But he's trying to make these reforms in terms of the French economy. And yes, the French economy does need major reform, but it's like a make or break for him, and you really can't see how he's going to turn it around. So who knows? He may have a very big majority in terms of the French Parliament, for want of a better word, because it's quite a complex process how it works there. But when you have the trade unions against you, you really are struggling. But that's symptomatic of a major problem in Europe, where he's up against not just economic problems, but also immigration is becoming a major problem in France, and people are getting very fed up with what's going on, and consequently, I think that's just fueling a lot of anger and resentment towards him. But how long will he politically survive? Well, he might survive the duration of his term of office, but if the French unions collapse France and bring everything to a grinding halt with national strikes, don't rule out the possibility of that happening. economically, it's going to be very deeply damaging to France, and who knows what the repercussions are. Bearing in mind that France is also in the process of rotating out of the European Union as it is now to the new European model. I mean, at one point it was going to be dragged along by Germany, but I think France is kind of more committed to that role and sees that there needs to be major changes in the European Union. But Macron's really under the cosh at the moment, which is not great for him. But more importantly, the repercussions for France could be pretty severe.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's going to be very interesting to see, especially since that Germany holds 90% of French debt, man.
Well, that's why, yeah, that's precisely why Germany was going to drag France along in the new European model, because obviously, if France doesn't get dragged along, then it's got major problems in the process. But German elections is pretty non-event. Merkel will get re-elected. I mean, Schulz has come out and said, "Oh, making all these promises." He knows he can make promises because he knows full well that he won't get elected, so it doesn't really matter. So, but I wouldn't get too despondent. Merkel getting elected is irrelevant in the grand scheme of things and in the bigger picture. But it will be the biggest shock in electoral history, far more shocking than to many people when Trump got elected if Merkel wasn't elected. And in many respects, if you had to choose between Merkel and Schulz, yeah, well, I think it's like, I mean, if you had to choose between Merkel and Schulz, frankly, I mean, it's not really a choice. But I think Schulz, I think, it'd be even worse than Merkel, and that is saying something. But yeah, it's not going to make a big difference because geopolitically, Germany's rotating, Germany's changing, and whether Merkel's remains in office or doesn't change the balance of Europe in that regard. And in some ways, it's better to have bad continuity than Schulz coming in and getting elected and doing well. Who knows what he might try to do? I think he'd struggle to do anything. And I'm certainly no advocate of Merkel, but I think Schulz would be even worse. And right now, no nation needs more instability than it already has.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, we're like 5 minutes out from the end of the show. Why don't you give out your closing comments and then also your services and how people can follow you?
Okay, thanks. Well, there's a few points I think worth mentioning about the US stock market. We don't talk about it because it doesn't really matter in terms of whether it goes, the Dow goes to 50,000 or 10,000 or a million or whatever it is. It's completely irrelevant. But what's kind of interesting is that for the last 10 weeks, there has been $30 billion worth of money has left the US stock market. Now, the question is who's selling and why? Well, we know who's propping up the market.
Rothschild just sold a whole bunch of US assets.
So clearly some big players are selling out of the markets and they're still being propped up to give the impression to you and I that everything's, hunky-dory. No, there's no problems. Just keep believing in the stock market. But that is a huge effort. And to put it in context, 10 weeks of consecutive outflows it's as high as the last time it was at that level wasn't even around the financial crisis. You have to go back to 2004 when that was the case. That shows just how deep this outflow is. That's something worth watching. I mean, we can observe that if it continues for any period of time and keeps going, then it's kind of definitely indicative of someone pumping the market to allow some big players to sell out. And of course, let's be honest, that wouldn't be any surprise to anyone because it's happened countless times before in history. The other thing that's interesting to observe is all the leveraged loans. There's been a record outflow recently of nearly $400 million now. Leveraged loans like ETFs and also mutual funds. That's what they cover. So there's a huge outflow of money in that respect. The question is who's selling out. I mean, okay, we're not talking billions, but it's significant. So mutual funds seem to be selling up and people are selling out of ETFs. Another indication that someone thinks something's not too far down the track. In terms of US, this sort of inventory to sales ratio. Now, obviously we've got falling prices and rising inventories. That's not a great mix for a sector that's loaded up on debt. But in the first half of 2017, 300 US retailers filed for bankruptcy. That's up 31% year on year, and it's small, medium, and large businesses. It's not just the small kind of what you call them, mom and pop stores. It's everybody who's in the process of selling. Now, it begged the question: is this dynamic unique to the retail industry, or is it a more systemic threat to US equities? Well, unsurprisingly, what you might call zombie businesses or companies in the US more than doubled between 2007 and 2015. So much of them much vaunted, well, we've sorted the economic crisis out in the US. Well, actually, and it was about 10% then. It's surged to even higher levels, or they haven't produced the stats, but you can guarantee it's not 10% now. It's probably 15, 20%. Now, the issue is as well is that high risk loans are now roughly 72% of total outstanding leveraged loan. That's up from 30% in 2007. Second quarter earnings for the small cap, the S&P 600, not the 500, they're all expected to be either flat or negative. So basically, all these businesses are in decline. And interestingly, as much as the Federal Reserve will spout about interest rate rises, if you raise interest rates in the US by nominal amounts, like 0.5%, 1%, they reckon 25% of US corporations are then at risk of default. Another example of why you can never raise interest rates, despite all the hot air rhetoric that comes out of the Federal Reserve. And interestingly, that figure of around 25% was also supported by the IMF. The IMF actually wrote a publication that said, yeah, we agree with this analysis. So you can see the clear contradiction between the IMF's perspective on it and the Feds who are just blowing hot air. Yeah, they let them raise interest rates, and all they'll do is destroy the US economy in the process. Yeah. So there was just a bit of current US economic data to support the reality that, once again, even though the stock markets are riding high, there are huge amounts of people divesting in them. And we're talking, you talk 30 billion in 10 weeks. That is a huge amount of money. That's not the likes of you and me selling US stocks. That's big, huge players selling stock. And in the process, the markets are just being pumped up to give the illusion that's all well. So the little guy, like investor, like you and me, are going to be caught by a sucker punch at some point in the future. Now, when is this going to happen? We don't know. We have to observe this. If in the next 5-10 weeks we still see these huge outflow, that someone thinks something's imminent. Now, imminent can mean many things, but clearly you don't start selling 30 billion in 10 weeks if you think the US stock market's solid and robust and reliable.
Absolutely correct. And the other thing here, Paul, is this: the fact that we can't even raise interest rates at any sort of real percent, even at the corporate level, where corporations, 25% of, maybe even up to 30% of corporations will be vaporized. That is proof positive. What I've been saying for years, you've been saying for years, or other individuals that are like-minded have been saying for years, and that is, this is proof that the entire economy is illiquid and is in a massive solvency crisis. And that is what is being covered up by a fictitious Dow.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that sums it up very succinctly. And what's kind of interesting is, as much as the Fed's coming out with these comments, the Bank of England have basically forecast now no interest rate rises for 2 years in the UK. But they're also basically admitting, well, it's more likely we'll have to lower interest rates. So what, from 0.25% to what? I don't know, 0? -1%, but this is the reality. The UK knows damn well it cannot raise interest rates, because you only raise interest rates when the economy is overheating. Well, with all due respect, show me one single Western economy that's overheating. I mean, it's just farcical, and it's just not reality in any way, shape, or form. So the UK is taking the responsible attitude of saying, well, we can't raise interest rates, but the reality is they're doomed whatever they do. If they don't raise interest rates, they're doomed, because the fact they've had low interest rates and QE for as long as they have is what's killed the economies. But if they raise interest rates, they'll kill the economy. So they're basically stuck in a holding position of damned if they do and damned if they don't. And that's why when people say, well, they can just keep pumping more and more money into economies. Well, look, what's that achieved? Nothing. It's destroyed economies. So yeah, let them keep pumping fictitious money into banking systems and into the Western economies and everything. All it's doing is wrecking economies even more. And they are stuck now, and it's a sort of ticking clock between, well, we don't raise interest rates, we're screwed. We raise interest rates, we're screwed. What are we going to do? Well, ultimately, you may see a situation where they can't raise interest rate. We start to have another systemic crisis, and they'll be literally pumping $1 trillion a month into the US economy to profit. In that situation, you have complete currency collapse, because hyperinflation ensues. The reason we haven't had hyperinflation is because all the money was stuck in Wall Street. It never reached the real economy. Yes, we're starting to see some price inflation in the UK, particularly in food. I've noticed it. Been a bit anal about things. I kept a track of buying stuff from the start of this year just purely out of interest to see, and then you buy the same products and we've noticed price rises over the first half of this year. Probably 10% rise, which is pretty steep, but they're only on items that are relatively cheap, so most people don't notice it. But the reality is we haven't had the hyperinflation because the money's all stayed in Wall Street, in the City of London. It's never escaped into the real economy. But they tried to pump the real economy, which they'd have to do if in a systemic crisis, then you just get hyperinflation like you won't believe. And that is a possibility, but I don't even think they'd have time to react to be able to do that. And if they did it, they'll just destroy everything. So any which way how, they've got no room for maneuver anymore. It's basically the end game. It's just how long is it till we reach the end of the end game? But we're well into, I don't know, 6th or 7th innings or something like that, for want of a better analogy. But that's basically where we are. Who knows on time? So when people give you dates and times, I don't take it literally, because nobody knows when exactly it's going to be, and it'll only frustrate people when it doesn't happen and they think, oh, it just means that it's never going to happen. It will happen. It's not a question of if. It's just a question of when. But every week and month, the real economy just gets weaker and weaker and weaker. And just the little discussion we've had now for the last 5 minutes or so on just a few examples of the US economy just clearly demonstrate why the real economy is cratering very badly now.
Yep, absolutely correct. London Paul, thank you so much, man, for coming on once again and sharing your viewpoints with us. Folks, you can follow his work at the Sirius Report on Twitter. And Paul, you closed out that Facebook group, correct?
Yeah, we just got a Facebook page now. That's the Sirius Report. Yeah, and we've obviously, as you mentioned, the Twitter page, and then obviously you very kindly plugged our podcast subscription series, which we had after we did the X22. We got quite a lot of people subscribing. So thank you to Dave for having us on there, and thank you to everyone who subscribed. But yeah, we'd like you to subscribe. It's $4.75 a month, which we think is extremely good value, and you get 22 podcasts roughly a month, depending on how many days in the month there is, but 10 to 15 minutes a day. Sometimes we do double podcasts because we don't necessarily always do one every day. But we'd encourage you to subscribe, because we provide broad depth and analysis of everything that's going on across the world. Some areas we cover in more detail, but as time progresses, we'll start to cover other areas in more detail when the time's relevant. But we try to focus on things that are happening at the moment that are worthy of note and consideration. And we don't just provide analysis. We give you intelligence. We give you background that isn't necessarily publicly known particularly. But we generally feel, our record speaks for itself. We have a good track record of getting things right. And that's the important thing, is that as long as we're kind of discussing things and we are broadly right, we're not always going to be right, because nobody can be. We don't have a crystal ball. It's the same for all of us in what we're doing. But we think we do a pretty good job, and we'd like you to subscribe, because It helps us to grow and expand what we're doing because we want to, make it bigger and better and improve things. And there's only the two of us doing it, so it's a huge undertaking on a daily basis in terms of what we're doing. But we don't have the resources or the capability to expand it anymore, simply because we don't have the finance to do it. But we'd like to expand in the future and grow it. And I'm sure it's like Rogue Money. We all want to grow and expand to become bigger and better in what we're doing, and to become a focal point for people to find out the reality of what's going on in the world, as opposed to the illusion that is very sadly prevalent in most publications, certainly in the mainstream media, but very sadly, the alternative media has got its fair share of people who are just clickbait and sensationalize the news just to get people to show interest in what they're doing.
Exactly correct. Exactly correct. London Paul, sir, once again, it is an honor and a privilege to have you on, sir. And we'll be back
thank you, and likewise. Yeah.
Definitely. And for those, real quick, just give a, send some love, prayers, and positive vibes to all those that are in Texas, especially in Houston, as the situation over there keeps getting worse. The genius idiots that run the city of Houston, Texas, thought it in their great minds to not even bother with an evacuation because, I heard from the grapevine is the democratically controlled libtard city of Houston felt it would be a great smack in the face against the conservative governor of Texas, trying to paint the picture of him being overreactionary to just a hurricane. It's not a big deal. Now we have tens of thousands that are trapped in Houston. We don't know the exact amount. Could be hundreds of thousands of people that are stuck there. You have no idea as to what's going on in terms of a body count. They are right now 30 feet of water. Houston's under 30 feet of water. It is incredible to see this type of damage. So, and that rain isn't letting up. It's going to continue to rain up until Thursday, maybe into early Friday. So this is tremendous. Another 25 inches of rain. It's shattering records, Paul.
Well, the thing is as well, it's the, it's the damage. Apparently they've had drones flying over Texas as a whole, and the damage is astronomical. So, it's going to take years to repair the damage. Every human life lost is priceless, but we also have to have the consideration, if you're going to rebuild Texas, it's going to cost tens of billions of dollars. It may end up being $100 billion. We've got no way of knowing until the storm dissipates and then an assessment gets made. But where's the money going to come from for that? We've seen what happened in Hurricane Katrina, and look at New Orleans. It still largely looks like it only just got hit yesterday. There's been no effort to regenerate the city. So the same process happens over Texas. There's got to be money provided to rebuild and rebuild people's shattered lives. And who knows what the death toll will be in the end. But we've seen some really heartwarming stories of people being saved and people working around the clock to rescue people, and they deserve our enormous appreciation and support for what they've done. But it's a catastrophic event, and who knows what the outcome is going to be, but it's going to put a huge pressure on the Trump administration to react and say, well, if it costs $100 billion, well, where's the finance going to come from to rebuild Texas? And Texas is heavily reliant on the oil industry. Well, how much damage is being done to all the oil industry now in the process? And I know I'm not deflecting away from the loss of life, but there are economic considerations because that's going to affect everybody's life.
Right.
And the rebuilding process has to happen quickly, but how quickly can it happen? Who knows? But from the drone reports, it seems like it's absolutely widespread and it's horrendous. And you use Houston as an example, but I'm sure Houston's not unique by any stretch in terms of what's been done. And for people to make political capital out of people's lives. If anyone wants to, articulate their anger and annoyance, these are the people who should be articulating that, because they're playing politics with people's lives.
Yes.
And that is utterly deplorable on every single level.
Correct.
But this is what politics has become like. We're back to the whole alt left, alt right. They have no care for people's lives, for people caring about people's well-being. It's just to score political points. And if whatever collateral damage happens, who cares? We're not interested, because those people don't care about the American people, or like they don't care about the British people or Europe or anywhere else for that matter. And here's a clear example, but we await developments. But my goodness, it's probably, well, the reports suggest it's the worst natural disaster that's happened in US history potentially, but we'll see what happens. But yeah, let's just hope, that everybody's safe and that the loss of life is minimized and people in Texas can get back to some sort of normality as quickly as possible.
Absolutely correct, man. Absolutely correct. Paul, thank you so much for being on, folks. Check him out, thesiriusreport.com, thesiriusreport.com, and you can follow us on roguemoney.net and subscribe to the channel, the YouTube channel. Hit the subscribe button if you like us. Hit us with a thumbs up. Hit that notification bell so you can be alerted the next time that London Paul goes live with us. With that being said, thank you all for listening in. Enjoy your weekends. Take it away, CJ.